Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Olympus Leica Digital 8-25mm f4 Pro, a wide to standard zoom for the Micro Four Thirds system. Announced in June 2021, it's the first new lens launched under the OM Digital Solutions brand and priced at $1,099 or 899 British pounds. Mounted on a Micro Four Thirds body such as those from Olympus or Panasonic, it delivers a 16 to 50mm equivalent range in full frame terms, taking you from ultra wide to standard coverage, making it a very flexible walk around option whether you're shooting stills or filming video. Before diving into my tests and comparisons, a big thank you to Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. Now, for many years I always felt the need to capture and generate all of my own B-roll for my projects, but I didn't always have the time, the gear, or indeed the skill to achieve the results that I really wanted. This is where a Storyblocks subscription proves invaluable, giving you unlimited access to an enormous and demand-driven library of royalty-free video, audio, and photos for you to enhance and, importantly, complete a project. I'm particularly fond of the hyperlapse sequences, which are well beyond my own patience to capture, or the sweeping drone shots, which I can't film because I'm a beginner pilot. The unlimited all-access plan provides full access to all their stock video in 1080 and 4K resolutions, along with After Effects templates, photos, illustrations, music, and even sound effects, which you can use as much as you like in any of your projects, allowing you to easily achieve the look and feel you really wanted. Learn more about how Storyblocks can make your life easier in the link below. Okay, now back to the Olympus 8-25mm, which I'll compare against two Leica DG alternatives in a similar range, the 8-18mm f2.8-4 and the 10-25mm f1.7. Filst, let's look at the lens itself, which measures 77mm in diameter, 89mm long, and weighs 411 grams with a 72mm filter thread. Now on the left is the Leica DG 8-18mm, which at 73x88mm is almost exactly the same length but a little narrower, allowing slightly smaller 67mm filters. The 8-18mm is lighter too at 315 grams, but both it and the Olympus 8-25 are in a similar ballpark. The 8-18mm retails at the same price as the new Olympus, but as an older lens it can be discounted closer to say $900. Meanwhile, the Leica DG 10-25 1.7 on the right is unsurprisingly the heftiest of the three, wider and longer than either at 88x128mm, requiring larger 77mm filters and heavier too at 690 grams, all thanks to that bright, constant aperture. It also makes it the most expensive at around $1,799. All three lenses are sealed against dust and moisture, but Olympus continues to be one of the few camera companies that's confident enough to quote an IPX1 rating. Since I also have them in my collection, it would seem rude not to also show you the new Olympus 8-25mm f4, flanked by the two older 7-14mm zooms, with the Lumix G 7-14 f4 on the left, and the Olympus 7-14mm f2.8 Pro on the right, both of which employ built-in petal hoods and no filter threads. Now, I've made multiple tests of these two lenses at cameralabs.com if you're interested, so in this particular review I'm going to concentrate on the three newer models. In terms of style and controls, the 8-25 looks like other models in the Olympus Pro series, but actually becomes the first in that range to employ a retracting barrel for a reduced size during transportation. So when you want to use the lens, you'll need to twist the zoom ring from the transport position to 8mm, and this extends the barrel by about 25mm. When you pass into the normal operating range, there's a mild click, but cleverly there's a little more resistance when turning in the opposite direction, which prevents you from accidentally returning to the retracted state unless you really mean to. Now that's a long-winded way of saying once you're in the normal zoom range, there's what feels like a fairly hard stop at 8mm, but a little extra push will click beyond it and let you fully retract the barrel for transportation. In use, it's really quick and you don't give it a second thought. Beyond the zoom ring is a free spinning motor-assisted manual focusing ring that can be alternatively pulled back towards the camera to reveal a focus distance scale with hard stops at each end. There's also a single programmable lens function button. In comparison, the Leica DG 8-18mm may have a barrel that moves back and forth as it zooms, but this itself is housed within an outer sleeve that effectively presents a fixed barrel. So it shares a similar length to the Olympus 8-25mm when that lens is retracted, but the Leica maintains this size during operation too. It also has a free spinning manual focusing ring, but no pullback clutch or programmable function button. And finally, the Leica DG 10-25mm employs a barrel that's at its shortest around the 13mm focal length before extending by about 15mm when zoomed to the long end of the zoom. Like the Olympus, it also has a free spinning focusing ring which can be pulled back to reveal distance markings and impose hardish stops. It is, however, the only lens of the three here to offer a dedicated aperture ring, unusually at the end of the barrel too, although it only works on Panasonic bodies, so Olympus owners should leave it set to A for body-based control. And now here's the three lenses fitted with their supplied hoods, starting with the Olympus 8-25, then the Leica DG 8-18, and finally the Leica DG 10-25. Okay, now for coverage, starting at the wide end of each lens. So here's the Olympus 8-25 at 8mm, followed by the Leica DG 8-18mm, also at 8mm, where you'll see it delivers almost exactly the same field of view. Now don't always assume that lenses that quote the same focal length actually capture the same field of view, as there can be variations, but they're pretty close here. And now for the Leica DG 10-25 at 10mm, where it's unsurprisingly delivering a slightly tighter field of view. It's still very wide, but it is visibly narrower than that first two. To illustrate the difference, here's the Olympus at 8mm, with the outer edge of the red rectangle indicating the coverage of the 10-25 at 10mm, so you can clearly see how much more 8mm will get you in practice. Now for the long end of each lens, starting with the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm, before switching to the Leica 10-25, also at 25mm, where it's a fraction wider in practice, but not enough to make any practical difference. But switching in the Leica 8-18 at 18mm really does show how much less magnified that lens is when it's at its long end. To illustrate the difference again, I've overlaid a rectangle showing the 25mm coverage on top of the 18mm frame, so that's what you'd need to crop down to match that field of view, and obviously lose some resolution if you were using the 18mm model. So while 25mm does reach standard coverage, the 18mm stays firmly in wide angle territory. So by taking you from ultra wide angle to standard coverage, the Olympus 8-25mm delivers the broadest range of the three lenses here, making it the most flexible and for many people a very practical general purpose option. To find out if that increased range comes at the cost of performance, I angled my landscape scene so that details run right into the far corners and photographed it with the Olympus 8-25 on an EM1 Mark II at all apertures and at both ends of the range. I repeated my tests with the Leica DG 8-18mm and 10-25, but annoyingly my 8-18 sample this time did not perform as well as in previous tests under close inspection, so I've had to make this first comparison a head-to-head between the 8-25 and the 10-25. Now if you'd like to see how the 8-18mm should perform, do check out my original review of it where I pitched it against those two 7-14mm lenses I showed you earlier, or better still, how about my 10-25 review, which includes direct comparisons against a better behaved copy. Links in the description. So let's start with the Olympus 8-25 at 8mm, and taking a closer look in the middle where I focus this image shows the lens behaving well as you'd hope at its maximum aperture, and closing it down shows no real benefit to sharpness. Moving into the far corner, there's a minor drop in sharpness, but still respectable quality at the maximum aperture. Closing the aperture gradually to f11 didn't make any significant difference in this particular test, so I'd say the Olympus was performing at its best pretty much out of the gate. I also retested with the focusing area repositioned from the center to the corner, and the results were the same here. Next, let's return to the middle of the Olympus 8-25mm image at 8mm f4 on the left and compare it against the middle of the Leica DG 10-25 on the right, this time at 10mm f1.7. Now since that lens starts out a little longer, the crop on the right shows a slightly smaller area. But looking at the sharpness of the details, I'd say the Leica is looking pretty good right out of the gate at f1.7. Indeed, when concentrating on the middle of the frame, there's little benefit to closing this lens down. Moving out to the corner, and again the longer focal length of the Leica on the right means I'm showing a different part of the pier, but from roughly the same part of the entire frame. With the Leica wide open to f1.7, there's quite obvious darkening in the corners due to vignetting. Now this mostly disappears by f2.8, and at f4 the lens benefits from a mild boost in corner sharpness too. I found it improved a little bit more at f5.6, but there weren't any extra benefits if I was focused in the corner rather than the middle. Now for a quick look at the Olympus 8-25, roughly midway through its range at 18mm, originally framed for a direct comparison against the 8-18mm lens from Leica, but I've had to reject that due to my particular copy of that lens not performing as well as it should. But I can still show you the shot from the Olympus, which at f4 looks fine in the middle and out into the corners. As you'll see, this lens performs pretty well right out of the gate at f4 across its entire focal range, and it doesn't force you to focus in the corners if you want sharp results in the extremes. Moving on, let's check out the Olympus 8-25mm at the long end. So here it is at 25mm f4, and taking a closer look in the middle again reveals fine details, so no problem there. Moving into the corners shows the lens becoming a little soft compared to the middle, but close it to f5.6 and it sharpens up nicely, and there's no real benefit to closing it any further, at least in terms of detail. Returning to the middle crop, let's compare the Olympus 8-25mm on the left with the Leica DG 10-25 on the right, both at 25mm and using their respective maximum apertures. Yep, that's f4 on the left and f1.7 on the right, but with them both delivering similar levels of resolved detail. Switching to the corner crop shows the Leica taking a lead in sharpness, albeit with greater darkening in the corners due to vignetting at f1.7. Close the Leica to f2.8 and this darkening becomes greatly reduced, and there's also a minor boost in sharpness that by f4 has become crisper overall than the Olympus at the same aperture. Next for a look at rendering of blurred backgrounds, starting with the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm f4 and focus quite close to the ornament. Even at close range, a 25mm f4 lens on micro four thirds is never going to deliver a particularly shallow depth of field, and this is the compromise of this particular lens. The bokeh blobs here are also nothing to write home about, with some visible outlining and faint onion ringing. Place the Olympus on the left and the Leica 10-25 on the right, both at 25mm and using their respective maximum apertures, and unsurprisingly the latter is delivering larger blobs at f1.7, albeit almost all of them here rendered as ovals until the aperture is close to f2.8 or smaller. I'd also say the style of the Leica 10-25 blobs isn't particularly smooth or outline free here either. Moving on to portrait distances, here's the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm f4 again, where as you'd expect there's not a great deal of separation with the background. Switching to the Leica DG 10-25 at 25-1.7 though shows a much shallower depth of field effect, although the background rendering is a little busier than I'd personally like. But if you want that kind of shallow depth of field effect from a zoom in this range, you're going to have to splurge on the Leica. And just for a quick comparison, here's the Leica 8-18mm at 18f4, where I'm happy to show the full image to give an idea of what's possible, just not examine it any closer on my test sample. Taking a closer look at the Olympus 8-25 on the left and the Leica 10-25 on the right shows the Leica is capturing slightly crisper details with a little higher contrast, even when both are set to their maximum apertures. But again, I'm not particularly fond of the background rendering of either lens here. So if you're after pin sharp portraits with nice creamy backgrounds, there's loads of great short telephoto primes in the micro four thirds system to choose from, like the fairly affordable Lumix G 42.5mm f1.7. Now for a single autofocus test, starting with the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm f4 when mounted on an EM1 Mark II body and using a central AF area to refocus on the two bottles. You can see it's pretty quick and confident in operation, and it was essentially silent too. I also tried the Olympus 8-25 on a Panasonic Lumix G9 body, and you can see it here doing the same test at 25mm f4. The contrast-based focusing on the G9 here, running the latest firmware, isn't quite as quick, but still fast enough and confidently lands where you want it to. Just for a quick comparison, here's the Leica 10-25 on the Olympus EM1 Mark II body at 25mm 1.7, where you can see it's still pretty quick even with the much larger aperture and shallow depth of field. And finally, the same Leica 10-25 on the Lumix G9, again at 25mm 1.7, and again a tad slower than the Olympus, but nothing that would affect day-to-day use in those single AF modes. For the videographers out there, here's the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm f4 on an EM1 Mark II, and again pulling focus between the bottles using a single AF area. And now for the same lens on the Lumix G9, where it can be slightly hesitant in this test, but still figures out where to focus and when to stop without overshooting. Now for a tougher test of continuous movie autofocus in low light, starting with the Olympus 8-25 at 25mm f4 on the EM1 Mark II, showing the kind of result you can expect when presenting pieces to camera. The phase detect autofocus on this camera does a good job at tracking my face here. Next, for the Leica DG 10-25 at 25mm 1.7, again on the EM1 Mark II, showing how even at a distance there's a nicer degree of separation possible when presenting with this lens. The focusing loses me momentarily as I move towards the camera, but once it snaps back again at closer range, you can enjoy some really nice shallower depth of field effects. And finally, the Leica DG 8-18mm at 18mm f4, where it's capturing a wider field of view than the last two lenses, and at f4 there's not a great deal of separation until you get really close to the lens. It's still a very practical option though. Others will want to use these lenses at their widest end for handheld vlogging. So here's the Olympus 8-25 at 8mm f4 on the EM1 Mark II with sensor shift IBIS stabilization only. Now the camera's doing a good job at stabilizing the footage and the 8mm coverage is nice and wide, but as with many wide lenses with IBIS, there can be some visible warping in the corners. Some of that can be mitigated by using sensor shift with the extra digital stabilization on the EM1 Mark II. So here's the same lens at 8mm f4, but with the field of view slightly cropped due to that extra stabilization process. And while it is a bit tighter, I'd say it's also less distracting in the corners. For comparison, here's the Leica DG 8-18mm at 8mm 2.8 on the EM1 Mark II using sensor shift IBIS alone. At f2.8 it's one stop brighter, letting me use a lower ISO and enjoy slightly more blurring in the background while matching the 8mm coverage, but like the Olympus there's visible warping in the corners. So here's the same lens at 8mm 2.8 but this time with IBIS and the extra digital stabilization applied, which again incurs a crop, but since the coverage was so wide to start with, it remains pretty usable. So which looks better? Here's the Olympus 8-25 on the left at 8mm f4 and the Leica 8-18mm on the right at 8mm 2.8, both showing their clips with IBIS and digital stabilization. So can you see any benefit to the brighter aperture of the Leica lens here? Next, here's the Leica DG 10-25 at 10mm 1.7 on the EM1 Mark II using sensor shift IBIS only, and the first thing you'll notice is the shallower depth of field and lower noise thanks to that f1.7 aperture. But while there is less warping than the other two lenses at 8mm, there's still some visible in the corners, and of course it is also a little bit tighter than those models due to shooting at 10mm. So here's the same lens on the same body, but this time with IBIS and extra digital stabilization, which has again cropped the image a little bit. This time any warping has essentially been eliminated, although now the field of view is looking a little bit too tight for handheld vlogging. Side by side with the Olympus on the left at 8mm f4 and the Leica on the right at 10mm 1.7, both with IBIS only, you can see the differences in coverage, depth of field and warping. And now for both lenses on the EM1 Mark II with the extra digital stabilization applied and the subsequent tighter field of view as a result. So do you have a preference between these four clips? Let me know. Before my final verdict, a quick look at focus breathing on the Olympus 8-25, here at 8mm f16, focusing between infinity and the closest distance, and back again, where you'll see the lens is essentially bereft of magnification differences due to breathing. And now at 25mm, again focusing between infinity and the closest distance and back again, where the lens shows a little breathing, but nothing to be concerned about. It's very well behaved in this regard, but is it unusual in the format? So here's the Leica DG 10-25 at 10mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, where you'll also see virtually no breathing at all. And now at 25mm, well, like the Olympus, there's a little breathing visible, but again nothing to be concerned about. The Leica 8-18mm also exhibited virtually no breathing, so all three lenses are similar in this regard. Okay, now for my final verdict, and as I share my thoughts about the lens, I'll show you a bunch of photos I took with the 8-25mm on an EM1 Mark II, and these are all JPEGs straight out of camera. They're also all available for a closer look in my review of the lens at cameralabs.com. The Olympus 8-25mm f4 Pro is a fresh and very welcome addition to the Micro Four Thirds system. Now there's loads of ultra-wide or standard zooms in the catalogue, but few that effectively cover both ranges. The earlier Leica DG 8-18mm started very wide, but often left you wanting to zoom a little longer. Then the Leica 10-25 sacrificed a little at the wide end to extend further and delighted everyone with its bright and constant f1.7 aperture, but this made it a heavy and expensive option for most of us. With the 8-25mm f4 Pro, Olympus has successfully filled the gap between these two Leicas, starting as wide as one and ending as long as the other, but opting for a more modest f4 aperture to keep the size, weight and cost down. The retracting mechanism also allows the lens to shrink to a compact size without getting in the way of operation. The result is a lens that delivers a very flexible range from ultra-wide to standard coverage with useful close-up focusing, a compact size and respectable results across the range. Sure, the f4 focal ratio on Micro Four Thirds means you won't be enjoying shallow depth of field effects unless your subject is very close, but that's about the only sacrifice to achieve what's arguably one of the most compelling walk-around lenses in the system. In fact, if I had to choose just one lens for general purpose use on a Micro Four Thirds body, the Olympus 8-25mm would be it, and it comes highly recommended. Oh, and if you are yearning for some portrait bokeh, just pair it with one of the many short telephotos in the system, like the Lumix G 42.5mm 1.7, which also doubles as a great close-up lens. Okay, that's it for this review. If you enjoy my comparisons and are thinking to yourself, just how can I reward Gordon for all these useful videos he makes for us, then simply click that subscribe button. Easy, right? And a big thanks also to Storyblocks for sponsoring this video, and you can find out how they can transform your projects in the link below. Let me know what you think of the lens in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.